The Great War was expected to only last for a few months. Instead, it dragged on for 4 years. The war introduced many new horrors, such as chemical warfare, trench warfare, and advanced weaponry. These horrors sparked a change in literature, as the changes the men of the war witnessed called for content to reflect their new reality. Rupert Brooke was an English poet who enrolled in the British Navy.
If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England.
Brooke died in 1915 due to blood poisoning. That same year, Canadian doctor John McCrane also took a patriotic approach to wartime poetry.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below.
Both of these poets wrote early on in the war, when there was still a belief that the war would be short. But as the war dragged on, wartime poetry started to reflect the melancholy the men were feeling. Englishman Wilfred Owen took this approach.
All a poet can do is warn. That is why the true poet must be truthful.
Owen authored Anthem for a Doomed Youth, which was kind of a downer.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle.
Siegfried Sassoon fought alongside Owen, and he also specialized in writing total downers. In 1918, he published the poem Counterattack.
The place was rotten with dead, green clumsy legs high-booted, sprawled and grovelled along the saps, and trunks, face downward in the sucking mud, wallowed like trodden sandbags loosely filled, and naked, sodden buttocks, mats of hair, bulged, clotted heads slept in the plastering slime.
Other prominent works include the novel All is Quiet on the Western Front, the epic Parade's End, and the novel Dr. Zhivago. Perhaps the most significant change the war made to literature was the introduction of the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation was a group of authors that reached adulthood either during or immediately after the war. Here's the lineup.
I volunteered to drive an ambulance in Italy. In 1918, I was wounded by Austrian fire. After I was wounded the first time, I attempted to carry an Italian soldier to safety. I was then wounded again by machine gun fire.
Ernest is one of the most famous writers who were influenced by the atrocities of World War I they experienced firsthand.
The way we write about war, or even think about war, was affected fundamentally by Hemingway. When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. Then when you are badly wounded for the first time, you lose that illusion and you know that it can happen to you. After being severely wounded 2 weeks before my 19th birthday, I had a bad time until I figured out that nothing could happen to me that had not happened to all the men before me.
Hemingway authored The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, which are somewhat autobiographical of Hemingway's experiences in war and post-war Europe.
I wrote The Sun Also Rises about Jake Barnes, a wounded soldier who had been left impotent by his wounds. He remains in Europe searching for life and meaning in a post-war Europe. A Farewell to Arms is about the post-war experience of Friedrich Henry, a wounded American soldier, and his cursed love affair with an English nurse, Catherine Barclay.
So yes, both of those are total mood killers. Next up is Gertrude Stein.
I was an art collector and novelist in Paris in the 1900s. I was friends with Hemingway, and I coined the term the Lost Generation while talking to him about the disillusionment felt by us creatives after the war. Disillusionment is kind of a buzzword for the Lost Generation.
Stein is a name that is frequently associated with the Lost Generation, but she was not actually involved in the war. Instead, she witnessed much of the war in Paris. She was close friends with Picasso, as well as many other creatives and intellectuals. She eventually authored Wars I Have Seen in 1945. Next up, we have F. Scott Fitzgerald. I dropped out of Princeton and took a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army. I was worried that I would die, so I started writing frantically. I didn't want to die without leaving the world the gift of my writing. I never actually made it into the war, but I did write the romantic Egotist, which I later adapted into my famous novel, This Side of Paradise. Ernest and Fitzgerald met in 1925 and became friends at first. Their rocky friendship ended with them criticizing each other over print, and by 1937, they were no longer on speaking terms. While Ernest wrote about the tragic effects of wartime injuries and the disillusionment and lost feelings associated with it, I focused more on the decadence of the American dream that people sought after post-World War I. My two most famous novels, The Great Gatsby and This Side of Paradise, focus on two protagonists who lead decadent lives. While Fitzgerald criticized decadence and spending in his literary works, he spent much of his adult life in debt. Fitzgerald's criticism of the American dream reflects his view that after the war, people were no longer focused on living self-sufficient lives, but rather on getting rich and distracting themselves from the reality of a post-World War. My wife was often referred to as a quintessential flapper. She smoked, drank, gambled, and flirted in public. The behavior of flappers was the result of the war, as women who had been employed during the war now sought freedom that men had had all along. While the public romanticized her, she spent most of her life in and out of insane asylums. She was also an author.
I wrote Save Me the Waltz, an autobiographical novel about our troubled marriage. Scott was angry at me because he wanted to use that topic.
As it might be clear by now, the Lost Generation was not a particularly happy group. Many of them suffered from mental illness and addiction. Next up, we have T.S. Eliot.
My first poem, published in 1915, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, laments feelings of emasculation and sexual frustration, which were a common side effect of the war. It shattered gender expectations for many.
It was Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, that had the strongest relationship to the war.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Eliot starts his poem out by describing a German landscape post-war. His description of the desolate scene alongside the title is an obvious allusion to post-war devastation by using the metaphor of a devastated landscape. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. Again, we see him allude to the war, mentioning the Archduke is in reference to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. When you get married for if you don't want children. Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home, they had a hot gammon, and they asked me into dinner to get a beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night, ta-ta. Good night. Good night. The lack of single poetic voice and the mix of high and low styles throughout the work underlines the absence of a single presence, perhaps signaling the absence of one unifying godlike presence in a post-war, post-religious world that has been torn apart by the Great War.
So yeah, that's Eliot. Kind of an odd duck. To make it clear, these authors are not the only members of the Lost Generation, but rather the ones who pioneered the concepts that solidified the base of the Lost Generation. Many of these writers are still acclaimed today for capturing the melancholy of life.
It was these writers who helped make way for the modernist movement. Modernism broke the mold of literature thus far.
Modernism focused less on romanticism and more on portraying real characters.
And not in a positive light. Modernism focused on real characters with complex motivations and showed these characters grappling with the upheaval of life.
The aftermath of the war plays into literature for years to come. Many books may not center on the war-related themes, but will usually have characters who were affected by the war in some way.
My book, Mrs. Dalloway, set in a post-war Britain, despite the fact that the war has ended, all the characters remain deeply affected by it. The main character suffers from PTSD.
While all these authors take different approaches on how to tackle literature in a post-war society, they all did so in a groundbreaking way that changed not only how literature is written, but also how we talk about the effects of the war.